To have this thing that you fought for wiped away at the speed of an email without any notice was devastating. But look, we've been here before.
You're listening to the Labor Notes podcast, a new show from Labor Notes. We put on the conference every 2 years, and we also have a magazine, and run dozens of organizing workshops and in-person events throughout the year. I'm Natasha, pod co-host and a staff writer in Philly.
And I'm Danielle, co-host of the pod and a Labor Notes organizer in New York City. Welcome to our show today. We'll be talking about federal workers and how they're responding to this administration. We'll also talk about a new group called the Federal Unionists Network, or FUN, which has been organizing rallies and bringing workers together to plan their next steps.
I've also heard them affectionately called the FU Network, which I'm very partial to. And we've got Labor Notes editor Jenny Brown back with us to talk about transportation security officers and what things have been like for them since this administration moved to end the TSA's collective bargaining agreement. We opened this episode with a quote by longtime TSA agent Joe Schuker, who told Jenny about a memo from the Department of Homeland Security earlier this month, which casually declared it was canceling the union contract for 47,000 workers at the Transportation Security Administration. We'll get to that.
Yeah, because this snap-of-the-finger approach seems to be the administration's MO to create cuts, chaos, and confusion in the federal government so far. And a lot has happened in the past couple of months since millions of federal employees got that first quote-unquote fork-in-the-road email from the Office of Personnel Management. So let's quickly break it down. Maybe we should start with what that first email even was.
Right, so the fork in the road subject line is a callback to an email that Twitter employees got right after Elon Musk took over the site, where he basically told them he was kicking them out if they couldn't get on board with his quote-unquote extremely hardcore plans to make them work like 80-hour weeks. So it was deja vu with this email to about 2 million federal workers in January that basically told them to resign and offered them what are almost certainly illusory promises that the OPM probably can't legally make, to pay them until September 30th if they do. The underlying threat was, we're going to be cutting a lot of jobs, so you might as well get out while the getting is good. Musk, of course, has been the public face of this slash-and-burn approach to the federal government and the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which, to be clear, isn't a government department. What Musk's official role, or what Doge even is, other than a reference to a Shiba Inu meme that someone last laughed at maybe a decade ago, is currently being debated in the courts. If there's a silver lining to all this, it's that all the money in the world doesn't make you funny or likable.
And it shouldn't make you above the law. Doge supposedly started as some type of task force for giving advice, but Musk is using it as an opening to try to push these big, dramatic cuts to federal agencies and seemingly ignoring union contracts and federal law. The cuts have targeted agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the IRS, the Energy Department, Housing and Urban Development, the EPA, and so forth. Something like 200,000 probationary employees who don't yet have the full protections of their union contracts have been told they're being let go, and other agency workers have been put on administrative leave. Now, whether or how much any of these changes will stick is unclear. Judges have already at least temporarily blocked Doge from accessing certain information and reinstated some of those probationary workers, but creating a sense of panic and turbulence is part of the goal here. Our coworker, Joe DeManuel Hall, wrote last month that federal unions have been organizing big visible rallies and are challenging these cuts in courts. And so many federal workers are now joining their unions and are connecting with one another through this new rank-and-file group called the Federal Unionists Network, which folks might also know from the nationwide Save Our Services Day of Action on February 19th.
How was it, by the way? You were at one of the ones in New York, right?
Yeah, I went to the rally downtown in the evening and it was absolutely freezing. So I was pretty impressed to see so many people out there supporting federal workers. There were 2 messages from the rally that really stuck with me. One was that we should really see what's happening with federal workers now as a canary in the coal mine for the rest of the labor movement. And the second was about how important it is to resist and not just roll over and let our government be corrupted easily.
Yeah, the way so many federal workers have been resisting has been incredible. Joe reported that many workers weren't going for the so-called deferred resignation offer after all. Musk said he hoped that around 5 to 10% of eligible federal workers would take the deal. But last month, the government reported number showed that just 75,000, or around 3%, did. For comparison, around 150,000 federal workers retire or quit every year. And within 24 hours after receiving the emails that they'd been fired, CFPB probationary workers organized pickets in New York City, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Chicago. So many more federal workers are also joining their unions and the Federal Unionists Network. More than 16,000 workers joined the American Federation of Government Employees in January and the first 10 days of February, which is more than twice the number of people who joined AFG in all of 2024. These events have spurred such an explosive growth in the union that AFG President Everett Kelly recently joked that he wanted to give Donald Trump an organizing award. Chris Doles, the president of the IFTPE Local 98 at the Army Corps of Engineers, and one of the leaders of the Federal Unionists Network, has called it a critical moment. He told O'Reilly last month, "The only way we have out of this is if the federal workforce on the front lines puts out a call to the broader labor movement and enters the streets and makes this a political crisis that they cannot manage."
Joe and Jenny's stories on how federal workers have been rising up to the challenge are on our website, labornotes.org. Joe's story was titled Federal Workers Organize Against Billionaire Power Grab, which we ran on Valentine's Day. And there's nothing more romantic to me than workers turning to one another against their boss. And Jenny's piece was titled Federal Workers Mobilize Against Musk and Trump's Corporate Coup, and we ran that one on February 20th. Now we have Jenny here to talk about one of the latest chapters in this administration's attack on federal workers, the Department of Homeland Security declaring it's canceling TSA workers' contract. Jenny, thanks so much for coming to talk about this. Can you tell us a bit about what happened on March 7th and what it's been like at the TSA since then?
Yeah, so this was a contract that AFGE signed with TSA in May of 2024, and it doesn't expire until 2031. DHS also stopped deducting union dues and ordered all union officers to immediately return to their duties as TSOs. That's Transportation Security Officers. TSOs told me that right after the memo came down, managers were already taunting workers about not having a union anymore. In one case in San Diego or in Virginia, they had a pizza party to celebrate that there was not a union anymore. And one of the workers I talked to, Lowell Denny, who is a TSO in Austin, Texas, told me that the quote unquote, the creep and rot were coming back really fast and that management was already telling TSOs not to call in sick. And this may be because at various points, TSOs have called in sick in protest of various management problems. So there's no grievance procedure anymore. And agency managers, workers said they expected the managers to go back to showing favoritism in deciding workers' schedules and basically get rid of the contract seniority rules. Management also ended this widely used system for trading shifts that was laid out in the contract. It allowed TSOs to make time for important life events by trading their shifts with other workers. And the workers predicted that the end of that would lead to a lot more people calling out.
Another new development is that AFG has started the process of laying off union staff, in part because of the drop-off in dues from TSA union members. Can the DHS just cancel a contract? Can their union challenge this?
Well, ordinarily the union would appeal the decision to the Federal Labor Relations Authority, which is the agency that certified the union in 2011. But the Trump administration illegally fired the authority's chair last month, and the agency's remaining members don't have a quorum to conduct business, so it's a very similar situation to what they tried to do to the NLRB. And by the way, the congressional Democrats under the Biden administration left the FLRA without a pro-worker majority too. So in case we forget, this attack on federal government workers has been a, kind of a bipartisan sport since the Clinton administration. But Trump also fired the TSA's director, David Pekoske, a guy that Trump himself had hired during his first term in 2017. And this was probably because Pekoske was really willing to work with the union. And a TSO that I talked to who works in Sacramento, Gilbert Galam, described all of this as premeditated. He said that the opposition very much did their homework when they decided they were going to union bust. And he said that TSOs have been sharing screenshots of the pages of Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership document, where the plan is to privatize the TSA and go back to how it was before 9/11, when it was a bunch of privately contracted companies doing security at airports. And I think it's very much an indicator of what Trump and Musk want to do to unions overall in both the public sector and the private sector, because they know that unions are the biggest obstacle to pushing workers around and the biggest obstacle to cutting, privatizing, and basically abolishing democracy.
And it seems like maybe workers are starting to notice this as well, because despite everything going on, these workers are fighting back and still trying to join the union. What are some of the things they're doing right now?
Well, for one thing, TSOs have actually been quickly signing up for electronic dues. So even though the union is no longer recognized, people are eager to sign up for it, which is an experience that people have had in other parts of the federal government. But the union has also sued in federal court, along with the communications workers who represent some other airport workers and the Association of Flight Attendants, the AFA. And those other unions are alleging that in addition to the illegality of breaking the contract, the administration's actions are making all workers in airports and aviation in general less safe. And one of the things that the administration said in the memo to justify breaking the contract is that TSOs would no longer have to pay dues to a union that, quote unquote, doesn't represent them. But in fact, like the rest of the federal sector, it's open shop, so you don't have to be a member of the union. But the union is required to represent all workers in the bargaining unit, whether they're members or not. So like many things in these error-filled, really lie-filled memos, it's the exact opposite of what the DHS director is saying.
So, the TSA was established in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. Can you say a little bit more about how TSA workers won their union in the first place?
Yeah, the TSOs voted in their union in 2011, and I covered the drive back then, actually, and it was really a brilliant strategy, I thought. They basically were able to win by acting like a union before it was even recognized that workers at TSA were going to be allowed to have a union. People who wanted the union joined and paid dues, and then they helped their coworkers with discipline issues, and they raised scheduling and other questions with management. And after several years of this, it worked. People came to understand what the union could do for them, and eventually they were able to convince the agency that they weren't going away, and they won the right to be recognized as a union, and then they were able to vote the union in. Over the years, they've been slowly improving things, but pay was still terrible because they were isolated from other government pay scales, basically from the beginning of TSA. And turnover was 20 to 25% a year, basically the highest in the federal government, due to the low pay. One TSO told me that people were leaving TSA to go work for the Chick-fil-A at that airport because the pay there was better and the hours were better. And that kind of turnover is really costly. Like training a new officer, they told me, can cost $40,000. And then when there's a shortage of workers, the employees left standing end up having to work excessive mandatory overtime, which gets them thinking about leaving too. But there was a huge step forward with this in the last contract, which was combined with convincing Congress to put TSOs on the same pay scale and under the same rules as other federal workers. And all that was just finalized in early 2024. But now this, right? But the workers I talked to who had been through the original union drive understood, like Joe Sugar said, that they've been here before. And because of their decades of experience, they understand that it's their organizing that got them the gains that they did get.
Do you have a sense of where TSOs might be heading in terms of direct actions?
Well, of course, federal workers have no right to strike, but there's some interesting precedent here. During the last Trump administration, TSOs had to work without pay for more than a month during that long government shutdown in January 2019, which was because of a fight in Congress over funding the border wall. After weeks of not getting a paycheck, TSOs started calling in sick, and, some of them didn't have gas to get to work, or they didn't have childcare money, and others may have been just calling in sick because they were objecting to being forced to work for free. And it started to have an effect. Airport terminals in Miami and Houston had to shut down. Flights started to back up. And at the same time, Sarah Nelson, president of the flight attendants, was calling for a general strike, arguing that flight attendants and passengers were being put at risk by all of this stress that was inflicted on both the TSOs and the air traffic controllers. And then Congress ended that government shutdown when the sort of blue flu situation spread to air traffic controllers, which gummed up airports all across the East Coast, and eventually that was the pressure. So airport workers have a lot of leverage. But it's interesting that we're already seeing the 3 unions representing airport workers lining up in this lawsuit. I thought that was a good sign. I think all the workers involved, and certainly their unions, realize that the courts are going to be unreliable in this situation. And it's really how they organize on the ground that's going to make it possible to stop the attacks, both on their unions and on the privatization of these services.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, that's our episode. Join us again next week, where we'll talk about how trolleybus workers in Mexico City have been successfully organizing against austerity measures. They built a powerful coalition with transit riders and environmentalists that helped save their jobs and win urgent investments in the transit system. You can read all these stories we talk about here on our website and in our magazine. You can subscribe to the Labor Notes magazine for $30 a year for 11 issues, or just $15 a year if you sign up for one of our events. You can find more info on our Linktree page, linktr.ee/labornotes. We have some workshops coming up later this month and in April, including our next online stewards workshop on Monday, March 31st. This one is on investigating grievances. We're also running our next Secrets of a Successful Organizer online series in April. We do these every 3 months or so. The next series also starts pretty soon, on Wednesday, April 2nd, so sign up now. The page is labornotes.org. You can find more info at labornotes.org/events.
Regular donations are how we sustain this work. Consider becoming a monthly donor or making a one-time donation at labornotes.org/donate. Labor Notes is proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. You can check out shows on the network at laborradionetwork.org. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode. The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Natasha Elena Ullman, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by Labor Notes labor climate organizer Keith Brower Brown. See you next time. Solidarity, y'all.